the way in which we've designed almost every organization, almost every structure within organizations, it's almost been like anti-nature. We standardize, we isolate, we get rid of redundancies in the means of, in the aim of optimization. What do you think nature has to teach us about the sustainability of that type of approach?
The function of hierarchies in nature is to control and avoid change. Well, even if you think Peter Drucker was talking about organizations as biological networks, I mean, this has been around for a long time. My theory is that is the false sense of control. There is a part of us of trying to avoid resistance for change because change is unknown, and unknown could be fear. We as humans want to create and contribute to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Redundancy is a strategy for resilience. The solution to our problems are already here. They have been refined for billions of years. So we should really allow ourselves to look outside.
Nature has a point of view. And if we can shut ourselves up for a second and tap into that point of view, then we can learn stuff.
It's basically condensing, if we condense the 3.8 billion years of existence into a calendar year, we humans, we're about 6 seconds to midnight. Often what we think of normal is not natural.
If you're worried about the idea is my company going to be relevant or going to exist in 20 years time, 30 years time, 50 years time, nature is probably a very good place to look. Okay, brilliant. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to Humanity Working. Now, as we get started today, I want to start with a quick story. A lot of you will know that my background is as an IT engineer and an architect, and for about 10 years of that, I was an enterprise architect. Now, if you don't know what one of those is, you can think of them as kind of like a city planner for a large organization. We create models as to what organizations should look like in the future, what they look like today, and what is needed to bridge that gap. Now, I did this, as I say, for about a decade, but in my last few years of doing this at Microsoft, I started to get really worried about how little we were taking into consideration these complicated biological systems at the center of every organization, the human beings. And I thought that we weren't just letting the humans down, but it was leading to worse results for the types of change that I was looking to make happen inside those organizations. And as some of you will know, that's what led to this podcast and to our Humanity Working newsletter. Well, about a month ago, that thinking got challenged again. I got an email out of the blue about something called biomimicry, which for me was a new concept. And shortly after that, I heard about the work of Ines Garcia. If you think about the work we do here as being around human centricity, hers is about this is my term, what I would call nature centricity. And I'm delighted that we've got Ines on the podcast today to talk about this. So welcome to Humanity Working, Ines.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
All right. So Ines has a book that goes into these concepts in some detail. I'm holding it up here on the video version of our podcast. It is called Nature's Blueprint for Business, Harnessing the Hidden Power of Edges. We won't get into all the details today. We will get into what she means by edges and why this stuff is important. As I say, we won't get into all the details though, but we hopefully will get a sense of what this is and why it's important. And my hope is that you'll get the same kind of awakening that I got, that this is something that is really important, and at least leave it with some interesting questions and thoughts about what potentially to do differently. But before we get into the specifics of this, I'd love for you, Ines, to explain in the easiest possible terms the term that I mentioned, biomimicry. So what is biomimicry? This is a lot more than making a building look like a bird's wing, right?
Certainly, yeah. And there are many examples of organizations today and products, such as tapping into form or structure, that maybe we'll have time to look at. But biomimicry, in essence, is innovation inspired by nature. It comes to the notion that life has been in this planet going for 3.8 billion years of existence. And that is fine-tuned strategies that we could tap into to solve our problems.
So what's interesting about your proposed application of it that you go into this book is that you're not just looking at it in terms of, oh, nature built this interesting product, so let's create the product that looks like this or pulls from this. But you're also looking at it in terms of how we design and run and modify and adapt our entire organizations, right?
Yeah, in a sense, because I think sometimes rather than like if you think the invention of Velcro, perhaps, right? We also need to think about the function. So what is the function that we are trying to accomplish? And we should be asking, how does nature solve that? Like the distribution of information, for example, or the flow of energy. Those are the things, those are functions that we want to achieve within our businesses. So let's ask, how does nature solve that? And then tap into that archive of almost 4 billion years to solve it.
Yeah. This is, I felt like the moment that I picked up this book and I started thinking about this, it kind of blew my mind in a way, because when you think about organizations today, which I guess the sort of version of an organization that people would be roughly familiar with, you can date back to around about the Industrial Revolution. As you point out in the book, the way in which we've designed almost every organization, almost every structure within organizations has almost been like anti-nature. We standardize, we isolate, we get rid of redundancies in the means of, in the aim of optimization. What do you think nature has to teach us about the sustainability of that type of approach?
Yeah, and I think when we think maybe a common way of organizing ourselves in organizations, it may just be just the last couple hundred years, Industrial Revolution, and so there is further knowledge and experience and history that we could also tap into. But if we think of edges, really is like an outside limit of an object, an area of a surface, and in organizations, we don't have real boundaries. We have artificial ones, right? It's just a cognitive creation for us to help us to make sense of a diverse reality that we live in. Yet, one of the repercussions of those sort of really defined cognitive boundaries, such as where the team starts and ends or a department, is like the intrinsic notion of the separation between those elements. And so generally when we look at a department structure on the elements, on the components, that forms the whole, that's where the focus, right? So what if we focus instead on the edges, the connections, what comprises those spaces, and how can those be not just sustainable and resilient, but also regenerative? Like how could we leave the entities within in a better state?
I'm reminded of a phrase that I heard a long time ago when I was looking into models back in the days when I was an enterprise architect. And for some reason, I went down like this long rabbit hole as to not just what models are, because I lived in the world of models, but why do we model, and what are the limitations of models, and how do models benefit us? Models in organizations have typically been used a lot to allow us to get an understanding of the complex entity that is our organization, increasingly complex entity that is our organization. But the phrase that I heard when I was doing the research was, the best model of a cat is a cat. And and what it was trying to get at, it was that other phrase you hear about models, which is all models are wrong and some models are useful. So what to me is intriguing here is that in the book you point out that we have things like organograms, the idea of like let's show what an organization is, and like structure an organization kind of in 2 dimensions. But the reality is that the organization itself is not in 2 dimensions. It's in 3 or 4 dimensions, if you want to include the time dimension in there as well. We'll get into the specifics of the edges in a moment here, but can you talk a little bit about how like an org chart is itself a restricting entity?
Yeah, and that sentence that you mentioned remind me this idea of frameworks don't have your interest at heart because they don't have your context. They don't know you. Those are frameworks or models, ways to help us. But they don't have that context, and therefore they are helpful, but also let's not get tied up too close. So you mentioned hierarchies, and so let's think about this. The function of hierarchies in nature is to control and avoid change. Restrict change. So that's the function of the tool. So I would imagine nowadays we would favor innovation instead. So therefore, artifacts from the 1800s that we haven't evolved may not be the best tool that we have at hand. So I think it's important to understand that when we omit the natural order in our sort of imagined constructions, it can generate detrimental disruption. And we're missing out sometimes with all these boxes and departments, sort of layer of abstraction and these artificial structures that we often look at is essentially splitting and competing for resources. Even at political level, is gaining terrain or gaining influence in the office politics. And so when we have these very linear, very compartmentalized structures, they don't encourage much exchange and flow, to which I would argue that's not at the C-level what we're trying to do. And kind of it becomes the story of the goose and the golden eggs, in a sense.
Uh-huh.
So I think there are tipping points where the bigger the organization, the more mature or immature that organization may be, the imagined separation of those different elements is wider, the definition of those modules is tighter, and the belief of each one being a truly separate entity sort of is higher. I think there is more options that we should be looking at than just legacy tools that we haven't really evolved.
In the middle of that answer, you said something that I thought was just like truly fascinating. You cover it in the book, and actually I think one of the most interesting things about your book is that you'll be in the middle of a paragraph and suddenly there'll be some almost like a throwaway remark, and you're like, whoa, and then you have to stop and think about that throwaway remark for 20 minutes, and it was the point you made about hierarchies. For me, as I'm just starting this process of trying to understand the depth of this, for me, one of the most interesting things about this is that makes it really practical is if you look at nature and you look at a thing that is happening inside a company, when you go look at nature, you might find lessons from nature as to how it actually works in practice that you can then bring back to your company. So that point that you just made about hierarchy, let's dwell on that just for a second, right? The purpose of a hierarchy in nature is to basically maintain stability and a status quo. Give us an example of that in nature to show definitively why that is. I think in the book you use examples of big cats and so on.
Sorry, say that again.
I think you from memory in the book, I think you use big cats as an example.
Yeah, we can tap also maybe some closer relative to us. Certain, like for example, chimpanzees will have hierarchy structures for command and for survival. You don't want to get too out of the common pattern because you will put your group in danger. Although, now that I'm saying that, also makes me think about other very close relative like bonobos, which they very easily suppress dominance. So it's also good to be reminded certain narrative that we have been reinforced and told ourselves again and again, that may be more to the story. But yeah, in terms of hierarchies, I think there are other structures that would be very helpful. Like, for example, if you think about how information may flow, how water flows, and this idea of fractal form, right? Form has its own function. So how can we have fractal structures that will help us to handle information better and also handle the over and under flow, right? What's happened when there is stress in the system? So where is our overflow and our underflow? Common ways for us to perceive hierarchies doesn't really handle that very well. It used to be waste.
Yeah. So it's almost like we've taken one thing that appears to work for our organization, and as we obviously understand, right, the interesting thing about a hierarchy is that for at least a period of time it sustains a level of stability, and it keeps the entities in power at the top of that hierarchy. They continue to remain in power for a period of time, but it creates something that potentially is quite rigid compared to other approaches that nature uses that we don't often replicate inside organizations, right?
Yeah, and also hierarchies sort of either amplify or suppress information, and it definitely sort of silos and filters out. And if we think about tapping into each other's ideas, we sort of like defeating the object that some of the strategies that we're trying to put in place is asking us for. It's just we're not using the right tools for the job.
Do you think this is why, because the world of work is shifting and changing so much, do you think this is why some organizations are experimenting increasingly with things like fractal organizations or holacracies or things like that?
Yeah, well, even if you think Peter Drucker was talking about organizations as biological networks, I mean, this has been around for a long time. My theory is that is the false sense of control. There is a part of us of trying to avoid resistance for change because change is unknown, and unknown could be fear. And there is all these psychological theories of we act upon feelings and mainly feelings of fear, and therefore this sense of false sense of control sort of catches our monkey brain more than our innovative brain, because we as humans want to create and contribute, be part of something bigger than ourselves. And that's why we do most of the things that we do. So I think it's good to be reminded that there is a lot of change in the way that we work today. I also think that we are at a tipping point of making informed decisions by our history. How are we going to use that tipping point? Are we going to leave ourselves in a better state, in a regenerative space, where we could be sort of going by inertia of interest of the members involved, rather than control or dismissal or loss of potentially workforce? So I hope that we have learned enough to take informed decisions that will leave us better.
Well, yeah, and actually, interestingly, you pointed a potential, I think, contradiction here, which is that if we're looking to model our organizations around nature, the most the part of nature that is likely to have the largest impact on organizations while people are in them are the people, right? The humans. And potentially, given the way that structures have formed and countries have formed and societies have formed throughout our human nature, it does look as though we seem to form when given choices, we tend to form largely sort of more hierarchical societies as we try to make sense of the world in which we live. Do you think we run the risk of potentially running into just human nature barriers that are going to cause us to always default to systems that protect us as humans?
Interesting, especially because you talk about the notion of human nature, and in the book that's something also I'm trying to break free from some repeated narrative of what is human nature and how can we nurture that human nature. If we think, for example, of biomimicry, biomimicry has these life principles to which, for example, one is about the ability to adapt to changing conditions. That is one of sort of those principles of our natural governing laws. So how can we maintain integrity through self-renewal? It's not how can we maintain sort of status quo by keeping rigid structures. How can we, and nature also does the adaptability, which I think is really important skill and is becoming more and more important, is incorporating diversity, embodying resilience. And resilience also would include redundancy. I think you mentioned that earlier. We tend to think of redundancy as a bad thing. Redundancy is a strategy for resilience. So sometimes it's perception. I do think that we need to allow ourselves to break free from certain narratives and preconditions that we have heard a lot, but they're not necessarily true. One of the things that we often see in organizations is what we call reorganizations, and that's lengthy, painful, and expensive process, and does not leave the members within in a better state. Also, we lose a lot of our institutional knowledge in the process. So I think it's time that we learn from our mistakes, really.
Yeah, I mean, that is to talk about the nature of what it is to be human, the ability to learn and adapt and adjust in faster because of the fact that we can communicate in sophisticated ways through language, and we can pass on information through writing, and we can change perceptions through, hopefully, as your book will. That should give us at least the opportunity to start behaving differently than we might do otherwise. There's a concept in the book, and sorry, the exact term you use is evading me right now, but it's something along the lines of quietening our intelligence or quietening our smartness or something like that. What's the term again?
Well, cleverness, or our perception of cleverness.
Yeah, quietening our cleverness. I I'm obviously not clever enough to remember it, but it was the, but I love
memory and intelligence are two different things.
Thank goodness for that, because I've got a terrible memory. But quietening our cleverness, I love the concept. So explain a little bit more about that, because I think it's related to something that humans could use a lot more of, which is humility.
Yeah, well, you explained that already. So if we think of what makes us different than other beings, each being have their own function as a group. But one of the things that makes us different is our ability, or at least at the understanding on science where we are now, is our ability to imagine. And that ability to imagine is something that we ought to tap into to leave us in a better state. So I'm diverting here a little bit, but remind me the core of the question again.
Go into some detail on this idea of quietening cleverness and, and what's at its core and why we need to do it.
Yeah, so thank you. So that idea of invention and imagination, and that is essentially cleverness. So when we are confronted with a challenge, we often tend to think around the options of solution from a blank canvas, or what we've done in the past. That is based on our conceptual perception and cognition, not necessarily grounded in the real world. And therefore, what I'm trying to bring across with quieting our cleverness and this idea of humility is the understanding that the solution to our problems are already here. They have been refined for billions of years. So we should really allow ourselves to look outside. We are governed by natural laws, regardless if we are aware of it or not, regardless if we like it or not. There are patterns and solutions in the living beings around us, right? They've been fine-tuned. It's R&D, an archive of R&D to tap into. So that's kind of what I'm coming with, that idea of quieting cleverness and ask, how does nature solve X function?
Yeah. And this for me was sort of, I think, probably one of the single biggest aha moments. I'll be honest, when I picked this thing up and I started thinking about this, I fully expected to enjoy it, which I did. But I've also fully expected that it was going to be almost solely about the idea of environmental sustainability and organizations having being built in such a way that they leave the planet in a better way than when they started as an entity. And there's elements of that in this. There definitely are elements of that in this, and environmental stewardship and things along those lines. But what was new for me was this idea that an organization, the most successful organizations on Earth, if you think of the success of an organization being how long it lasts, the most successful sort of entities that you can think of as companies, organizations you think of as companies, are maybe a couple hundred years old. Well, the life on Earth is 3.8 billion years old, and there are individual species on Earth that have been around for a minimum hundreds of millions of years. And if you go down to single cell organisms or simple multi-cell organisms even longer than that. And so here we are in our little very human-centric world, thinking that every solution to every problem is the result of us and our intelligence. And maybe that's something like with our little podcast here and our newsletter, maybe we even add to that perception as we talk about human centricity and and all of this idea. What what you show, I think, kind of beautifully is that human centricity, or the idea of like our role as humans, it obviously has some merit when we're looking at the rise of the machines and how we make sure that we as humans have some relevance within it. But it's also happening in the space of a much larger world, where even if nature certainly addressed these problems, nature's addressed how to do resilience, nature's addressed how to do adaptability, nature has addressed how to have different parts of an ecosystem communicate and collaborate with each other. All of these things that are necessary in order for us to be able to thrive. Nature has a point of view. And if we can shut ourselves up for a second and tap into that point of view, then we can learn stuff, and that it goes beyond how to take how a bird flaps its wings and mimic that in the next generation of our aircraft, although that's an important that's obviously an important use case. But it goes beyond that towards how we approach every aspect of our life. And so that I mentioned humility because that was sort of like the first thing that kind of popped in my head. I'm thinking, we've been, like, by ignoring what's going on in the world around us, we're missing all of these clues that are all around us as to how potentially we could approach things differently. My question for you is actually a personal one. My guess is that you've not, it wasn't since you walked the earth that you were that you were suddenly like, oh, I'm this little thing in this larger thing that is nature, and there's a whole bunch I can learn from nature. So how did you personally get to this idea of like deeply learning from this bigger world around you?
Wow. Okay. So one pre-thought and then to your answer. I think it's from the Biomimicry Institute. There is a visual that for me really helped me to see that perception of how the humility piece that you were talking about, and is basically condensing, if we condense the 3.8 billion years of existence into a calendar year, we humans, we're about 6 seconds to midnight or something like that.
Yeah, I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah, which I found that incredibly powerful. My journey, in fact, is relatively recent, I would say, because so I come from communication background. I have a double degree in comms, marketing, advertisement, PR. I've done some work as PR for Segway, 2 wheels, 1 platform, supposed to revolutionize the commuting. And part of my job was convincing politicians to jump into this thing, to have media coverage. I'm talking about 20 years ago. That led me to further work in comms, but internal comms in organizations, communication within. And there we tend to think of throwing tech, and tech can be a great enabler, but tech by itself doesn't do very much. And that led me to this idea of delivering in a more agile way, right? So where can we reduce noise and frustration and become more agile into what we're trying to achieve? To which that led me into understanding that there is more than just churning value or perceived value. And then I took myself through a circular economy executive program with Cambridge University, and that broadened the horizon of, reduce waste of time, but reduce waste of effort and finances and materials and energy. And then I went into my quest from my previous book, couple years research of how could I make my own company, One Person Ltd, sustainable by design, like a fabric layer of the business. To which that if we think of circular economy, we often talk about the 5 hours, 7 hours, 9, 11 hours. we don't talk enough, I don't think, about the principles, and especially the principle 3, which is regenerate the natural systems. So yes, keep products and materials in use for as long as possible. Yes, reduce waste and pollution, but regenerate the natural systems, like ecosystem services for free.
Yeah.
And that led me then into this concept of biomimicry. And I went through a 6-month program into how the work that I do with organizations, how can those be more resilient. And that took me to discovering the edge effect, if you like. Maybe we could name it.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. Let's go now deep into this concept of edges. So edges, I think, is where a lot of this becomes sort of theoretical, but at the same time it can become deeply practical very quickly. Let's start with what an edge even is in biology terms, and why, from a ecology perspective or an ecosystem perspective, why edges are particularly important. I loved your examples of edges of rivers as a good example.
Yeah, rivers are edges, ecotones are edges. Your garden, if you have a garden, and you stop mowing in a corner, you will be creating an edge very, very quickly. Or if you stop hoovering a corner in your house, you will very quickly create an edge, and you will be able to observe how that edge very quickly increases resources, and therefore more resources, more exchange. So if we take these ideas a little bit, how we work in companies, and we could be asking ourselves, okay, so how could we increase edge or a perimeter if we think maybe of a pond, right, rather than having a square? If we increase that perimeter of the pond, even that the surface area is the same, even that the volume is the same, when we have a greater perimeter, we have more opportunities of collecting resources. And if we think our company, with our company hat on, resources as documents, devices, finance.
Yeah.
I'm purposely not saying humans. Increases also the opportunity, that sort of extra perimeter of spaces for the members' interactions, right? Diversity of micro environments. The increase of edge, it will increase the exchange of ideas, of knowledge, of energy, and that sort of redundancy, resilience by design, and also sort of increases the density of activities in a small area. I think all those things are good things that we want to encourage in our organization. So structure informs culture, and therefore I think there are better structures that will help us to achieve what we want.
Yeah, to go back to the biology piece of it just a tiny bit. If you think about, for example, the edge of a pond, the edge of a river, the edge of a lake, something along those lines, right? You've got the ecosystem within it, you've got the ecosystem on the outside of it, and then you've got the ecosystem right at the edge. And that ecosystem at the edge, by definition, almost everywhere we see it in nature, is where a lot of the interesting stuff happens, right? A lot of the interesting stuff happens because you've got these things that are theoretically separate from each other are actually interacting with each other. And you even explain in our own bodies, right, where we have these edges between the different parts of who we are. The cell wall is a very interesting thing in a plant. The cell membrane in a human is a very interesting thing. These are where the interesting activities happen. But that area at the edge is so interesting because you've got people that are using the river as resources but are not of the river. And you can talk about like an estuary, for example, where you've got the saltwater part and you've got the freshwater part, and then there's sort of this interaction that is happening between the two, and again, a much more rich ecosystem. So it feels like when we translate this concept into organizations, by creating greater, as you point out, right, a greater perimeter by creating these getting even interested in what these edges are, which typically organizations have not, right? They do their bits of isolation. They'll communicate in very rigid senses between them. But by creating these broader edges, we are by definition creating an opportunity for an organization to, for example, innovate more, right?
Yeah, that's it. And if you remember, one of the earlier on sort of visuals of the book is a side-to-side comparison of some of the ways that we structure. We talk about organizational charts, but also departmental communication, or even across your value stream. How does that look like versus maybe how atoms sort of bend and evolve, or how coral fossils looks like, or even an example of a boundary between two countries where we perceive as a straight line. In fact, they're not. So I think this notion of understanding form for the function that could help us to allow our own regulation of focus of the energy of the materials within that space, to be locally attuned to the conditions and external factors. We were talking about adaptability as scale. I think the answers are here, but are we allowing ourselves to quiet and listen? I think that's the question.
So now let's talk about resilience, which is something we talk about a huge amount on the podcast, but in a very human-centric way. For those of you that have been listening to recent episodes, we actually just did one on resilience, and we think of resilience in our human-centric way as being the ability to be able to cope intellectually and emotionally with change. But you think of it in a broader sense. Talk about how you think of resilience, and specifically how nature builds resilience in a way that is quite different to the way that organizations tend to or do not.
Well, nature creates resilience by a few strategies. One is redundancy. We spoke a little bit about that. But also think about the ability to sort of come back from a stress or an injury. How can you reorganize ourselves and the connections within from learning from that stress? And we are particularly bad in our organization. Yeah. We get a pandemic and then everything back to define normal, common, right? So often when we think of normal is not natural. If we have an injury playing sport, or we sit in bed at the desk, then you'll see you have a problem in your hip, and then you start saying that your knee is giving you troubles. Why? Because your body will always shuffle to what is responsive to the learning injury. And so what can we do in our organizations to help that? I was talking about sort of like the inflow and outflow when there is stresses in your system. How imagine the ability for movement of the elements within, right? So space, finance, members, to sort of self-allocate where it fits best, especially this idea of interest by design, so that we can evolve as of when is needed and wanted. So yeah, it could look in multiple different ways, like maybe an irregular branched structure or fractal organizations, channels, connections, right? Creating more relationships at the edges so you are more tactile, like an octopus, you know what's happening from lived experience. So don't let me divert too much, but there is a lot to learn.
So for anyone who is finding this inspiring, because I think a lot of people will be, but also potentially a little bit abstract, which is understandable because these are relatively new ideas, and sort of really concrete examples of practice are sometimes more difficult to establish. But can you think of something that you could recommend to an organizational leader, for example, that would be a practical step where they can start thinking about or doing something differently tomorrow that is inspired by the nature around us?
Okay, you make me choose one thing of the many, many.
I know.
All right, so let's think about this, and I think I have it quite recent, and that's why it's coming at the forefront here. So, for example, in the book we talk about the research on brain capillary networks across the species as well, and sort of it reveals that a very simple organizational requirements are sufficient to be able to reproduce both the structure and function. And if we think about networks where each node sort of connects often around 3 others, and that creates a very interesting flow that is repeated in other spaces in nature. And it creates that sort of inherent redundancy. Why is that important? Because if one pathway fails, then alternative exists without excessive sort of complexity or resource waste or anything like that. So this is important, and it's very simple thing that one can start thinking about to introduce, so that when something happens or that person doesn't is not at work for whatever reason, or you have that resiliency in your system. Even ants, they go exploring in threes. And I sort of developed this idea of, I call it triadic connections. So it's how can you design and incorporate this idea to ensure that even in meetings, participants form those relationships rather than a buddy system. It's a trio of increasing and creating those cyclical processes that is going to allow for increase of institutional knowledge and pass-on experience and information transfer rather than silo or sort of half-baked information pass-on, right? Every layer of transition and translation is also a layer of waste. So how can you create that shared repository of relatively simple thing to put in place? So I'm working with an organization at the moment that they just start including this sort of triadic connection in the way that they operate. So that's relatively low entry, easy point, I would argue, from some of these big ideas.
Fascinating stuff. I think for any organization that is a little bit worried about the world in which we live right now, folks will have heard me talk quite a bit and discuss with folks like Bob Johansen this concept of BANI, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. This strange world in which we live right now that potentially introduces fragility into our organizations. If you're worried about the idea is my company going to be relevant or going to exist in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 50 years' time, nature is probably a very good place to look, and Ines's book will help you understand some of the things to think about. I want to thank you, Ines, for helping me think very differently. I know that this is the start of a journey for me in terms of trying to understand this more deeply, and I hope that our audience has got an understanding and a little bit of a introduction to some of this very enlightening world. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paul and Matt, for the work that you do. I think the future of work is here, and so these conversations really, really matter.
Completely agree. Thank you. All right.